5.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're safe and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects. This is the third in a series of events titled America the Unprepared. I have to confess that I assume, like many of you, I'm at sea unsettled and perhaps even quite fearful, given the fact that we're in the middle of a global pandemic and perhaps one of the most unique and severe crises in American history. That crisis has already claimed 45,000 plus lives of our fellow citizens, sickened hundreds of thousands more, shut down an economy, changed life as we've known it, at least to date, and turned the most innocent of objects, packages, doorknobs, countertops, and even our fellow citizens into hostile entities that are potentially hazardous, if not fatal to our health. And to tell you the truth, when I look at America confronting crises, both domestic and foreign, I have many more questions than I have answers. Just a few. Does the pattern of surprise and unpreparedness that seems to characterize much of the American response to crisis, as early as Pearl Harbor to 9/11, to Katrina, to the Great Recession of 2008, and to COVID, does it warrant the title of America the Unprepared? Or is it too harsh a judgment? Maybe there are limits beyond which governments cannot go, those limits underscored by human weakness, by the systemic failures, by inertia, by the failure of imagination, and the power which we obviously do not have to see around corners. Is Leon Panetta right when he says, quote, we always wait for crisis? I know the human failings we're dealing with, but the responsibility of people elected to these jobs is to make sure we aren't caught unawares? And is it primarily a question of leadership at the top, at the presidential level, or a lack thereof? Or are the challenges more deeply rooted in bureaucratic inertia, interagency rivalry, positions unfilled, politicized, maybe even the absence of continuity in those positions? As one NSC staffer quipped, you never want to be exchanging business cards at the scene of a disaster. Or maybe, as Tom Ridge noted, former Secretary of Homeland Security, we're delighted to have Michael Chertoff here with us today, that in a democracy like ours, response rather than preemption is going to be the rule rather than the exception. And finally, in the midst of crisis, what are the lessons that we are now learning and will learn? When this is over, more money for public health, a bigger stockpile of medical equipment, a new agency, maybe a defense viral Department of Defense, a COVID-19 commission. If we can't be ready, in conclusion, can we be readier? So to unpack all of this and to leave us less confused, or at least to leave me less confused than I am, we're honored to be joined today by three veterans of the national disaster and homeland security business. They've been on the front lines for a long time. They're thoughtful, and they've been sounding, to quote one of our panelists, Juliette Kayyem, the alarm that homeland security, far from being an add-on to national security, is in fact a centerpiece. Because if you can't protect the homeland, well then, Michael Chertoff is a co-founder of the Chertoff Group, former Secretary, Department of Homeland Security, former federal judge, and U.S. Assistant Attorney General in the Criminal Division. Juliette Kayyem is currently faculty chair, Homeland Security and Global Health Projects at Harvard's Kennedy School, a former Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at DHS under President Obama, and the author of Security Mom, a book I think I want to read. And finally, the inestimable Francis Townsend, who is now Executive Vice President for Worldwide Government, Legal and Business Affairs at McAndrews and Forbes, formerly Homeland and Counterterrorism Advisor for George W. Bush, as well as a former Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism. Each will share their views in roughly 5 minutes. We'll turn to a round of moderated conversation, and then we'll go to all of our participants' questions and answers. I would remind all of those who have questions that at the end of the event, it'll be a live Q&A session where you can ask us a question, and to do so, use the live chat feature in YouTube, email us at pressoffice@ceip.org, or tweet at us at Carnegie Endow using the hashtag Carnegie Connects. So with that, Michael, Secretary Chertoff, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Aaron. And again, I want to echo the wish that everybody stay safe and be careful. Look, I think the bottom line is every disaster and an emergency is ugly. There's never one that's easy and smooth, but there are degrees of readiness. One cannot say that this was not foreseeable. In fact, Fran will remember that over a dozen years ago, we put together a very detailed plan about the possibility of a bio event, whether it be bioterrorism or a pandemic, and tried to evaluate all the issues we would need to prepare, all the capabilities we would need, what needed to be stockpiled, et cetera, et cetera. What's happened over time, I think, is we've had a number of near misses. There was SARS.
Michael, have we lost?
I beg your pardon?
I'm sorry. I think, I'm sorry, go ahead. I thought I lost you for a minute.
We had SARS, we had Ebola. Those were near misses. It may have engendered a sense of complacency, and I certainly gather that the stockpile of necessary medical equipment has degraded over time. And I think there's a lesson there about complacency and not averting disasters some of the time lead you to believe you'll be able to do that all the time. Let me say briefly, though, I think there are 3 elements that are critical that we need to build for the future to prevent this from happening again. And again, we're not going to stop it, but we can manage it better. One is planning. Again, we need to know and we need to exercise the plan for who does what the responsibilities are, what the authorities are, what the capabilities are. As somebody said a little bit earlier, you don't want to be exchanging business cards the day of the emergency. Second thing is resiliency. In the last 10, 20 years, the culture of business in this country has been very much about hyper efficiency. Everything is just in time. You don't want to have anything you don't need right now because that keeps costs down. The problem is it doesn't give you any redundancy to call upon when you have an emergency. And I do think the government has an obligation to make sure that we build resiliency into the system, including incentives for the private sector to have a certain amount of resiliency and redundancy so they don't get caught short. And the third thing is globalization. People are viewing this as an example of the problem of globalization. But the reality is, this teaches us you need to have global action to deal with a certain category of threats, because there's no way a single nation can protect itself or insulate itself from certain kinds of risks. It can't do it with respect to a pandemic, because to truly hermetically seal yourself, you would wind up destroying your economy for good. I think we're going to see the same thing with climate change, if I can make note of the fact it's Earth Day today.
Yeah.
This is again something which challenges all nations. No nation can go it alone, because if you try to go it alone, you're going to wind up breathing the same polluted air and dealing with the same rising seas as everybody else. So having a plan and building resiliency and having a program in place to cooperate with other countries, including, honestly, even countries where we often disagree, but where we can reach an understanding that we're all in the same boat, so to speak. I think those are going to be the keys going forward. I'm quite sure there will be a 9/11 Commission type evaluation after the fact. But the key here is not finger pointing. The key is, what are the lessons we have to embed in our government and in our private sector to prevent these kinds of things from overwhelming us in the future? Thank you.
Michael, thank you. Juliette, to you.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me. And I wish good health to everyone viewing, and hope everyone is staying inside, obviously so. I wanted to just make 4 points about the Homeland Security generally. I worked in state government for a governor, Deval Patrick, as his Homeland Security advisor. And then my role at the department was integrating state, local, territorial, and tribal capacities. So really, I spent a lot of time in the homeland and sort of what am I seeing about this that's both unique to coronavirus, but also I think very similar to other homeland challenges we have had. I think the first is that is the challenge of what we call a slow roll crisis. As as Fran and Michael know, if the bomb goes off, if the hurricane comes, if the tidal wave, the tsunami, whatever, earthquake, you can activate your public safety apparatus, your local, state, and federal safety apparatus easily. The bodies are there, the debris is there, you know what to do. I think what we saw in terms of what's now understood as the squandered months, right? January and February was not only sort of an inability to see what was coming, and now we have new data to suggest that it was already here in January, but it's very difficult to mobilize politically, operationally for for a slow roll crisis. So that what you saw in March, different states and different mayors and even the federal government sort of off sync in terms of mobilization really was not surprising, because there wasn't that single moment. The second is the nature of this crisis, which we'll probably we see a lot in others, but nothing like this, is just the 50 state activation aspect of this. I often say that the challenge of Homeland Security is not the security part. We know how to do that. It's the homeland. That's just the governance challenges between mayors and governors that you're seeing some of the conflicts, and certainly the governors and the federal government. They are pronounced now. There is no question about it. This White House sort of views itself as having I think a sort of separate federal operational lane. That's not normally how it's done. We talk about unity of effort, where local, state, and federal unify for a common good. You, especially with the supply chain, you're seeing the tensions around that. But the governance challenges are real, and they make almost every homeland disaster look like a real disaster, if not a metaphorical one. And it's just worth noting that it's very different than, say, a sort of chain of command in the military posture. It's just our homeland does not work that way. The third is something that we see in climate change, certainly, or not climate change, but climate disasters, and it's the preparedness paradox. We're kind of living it right now. It drives me nuts. But these people who say, look, the deaths aren't that bad. I don't know why they're saying that. We're hitting 45,000, but it's not as bad as we thought. Let's open up. But they're not factoring in the reason for why it's not as bad, and that is, of course, the social distancing. We call this the preparedness paradox. The more people prepare, the less damage is done, and then they think that you've overreacted and that they should just go on with their lives. It's a challenge in climate disasters. You tell a city to evacuate, and then the hurricane doesn't come, or the hurricane doesn't kill that many people. That might have been because of the evacuation. Or think on the state level, when governors close highways during blizzards, people say, well, it wasn't that bad. Well, of course it wasn't that bad, because you didn't have 2,000 cars stuck on the turnpike. So just that's what we're experiencing right now, this preparedness paradox, which occurs and is a challenge for preparedness, because people are always Monday morning quarterbacking. The final one, which I think is very unique to this, sort of getting outside the politics of what's going on, is the recovery. Let's assume we get to recovery. Lots of talks about kits and the metrics and everything, but there is no question in anyone's mind that however we open up, the next couple years are going to be, for want of a better word, funky. They will be different. It's not a new normal. It's like I call it the now normal. Every day will be different. And that is because unlike most disasters where the hurricane comes and goes, or the earthquake shakes the earth, you have your response. We know how to drive resources to it. And then you have your recovery. Sometimes they overlap, but the danger is always gone. What we're heading to the next couple of years is we'll have better tools to manage the virus. We'll hopefully have better testing and tracing. We'll have hopefully treatments, which I'm pretty optimistic about. We'll live differently. We'll make our choices differently about where we go in restaurants and do we want to go to sporting events? There'll be all sorts of ways in which we live differently, but that's because we will be living with the danger until ultimately there's a vaccine. And that is just going to take a lot of adaptation, not just by our public leaders, but by every American. That I don't know an equivalent, but that's sort of what we're looking at for the next couple of years. As people often say, this is not a light switch. It's a bit of a dance for the next couple of years.
Juliette, thank you. Fran, to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with both Juliette and Michael. So let me take the opportunity to sort of address things both of them raised. Michael talked about understanding roles, and I will tell you the one thing, having dealt with both natural disasters and man-made disasters and terrorism events, is that this is true whether you're talking about internally to the federal government or from the feds to the state and locals. The cardinal rule here is all understanding that every disaster is a local event. These disasters do not happen inside the Beltway, and no one in the United States looks to Washington to be their first responder. And so everybody's got to understand that in that sense, the federal government, and like Juliette, my government experience starts with a local experience. The federal government is always the supporting, in a military sense, the supporting command, not the supported command. The feds are not used to being in that role. They're not used to not driving the bus. And in this case, you're not in a disaster in terms of the response. You can be in the driver's seat in terms of the preparation. And actually, the feds can play their most important role before the disaster strikes. It's to the point that you made when you opened about you don't want to exchange business cards before, at the event. Michael will recall in 2005 when the president charged me with writing this first pandemic strategy, we had a cabinet level exercise, every single cabinet member on a weekend, none of them happy about it, to understand and roles and responsibilities, who had what legal authorities, who would be in charge for what responsibilities. And by the way, sitting in that room together, when I would ask a question, well, who's in charge of this particular event? Guess what? More than one hand went up. And that was the time for us to understand and talk among ourselves and work through those issues. It's also the time to work through those issues and understand what are the unique capabilities of the federal government. The federal government uniquely can sign emergency declarations. We know that very well for natural disasters. In this instance, the federal government is in the unique position of triggering the Defense Production Act and helping to manage the supply chain. And so you have to understand that, and you have to understand what does it take to manage that? Under what circumstances will you trigger that? That's not unknowable. That's knowable in advance. And by the way, you ought to, in terms of exercising that capability, you ought to talk to the private sector. Again, I go back to 2005, 2006, when we wrote the strategy, we met with the pharmaceutical industry. We knew what it was going to take to get with the vaccine manufacturers, and if we had to trigger the Defense Production Act. We met with them. We understood what it was going to take in terms of cash to change production lines, production timeframes, all these things, because if you exercise, you understand better the capability. Juliette mentions the difference between sort of a quick event, the bodies are on the ground, the debris is on the ground, versus a slow rolling event. I will tell you, in some respects, give me the slow rolling event. I disagree in the sense that it's harder. It may be harder to generate the political will to act, But I will tell you, you can't make up for the time that you need if you're not well prepared in a quick event. You can in a slow roll event. This was an instance where if they had not been well prepared in terms of the management of the strategic national stockpile, in a slow roll event, you've got time then to go back and fix a mistake if you're not well prepared in a slow roll event. Now, clearly that didn't happen here. And I will tell you, one of the things that people are going to have to go back and understand is we understood very well going back to 2005, the necessity of social distancing, the need to flatten the curve because of overwhelming the healthcare system, the lack of adequate ventilators, the lack of adequate hospital beds and healthcare workers. That's all been known for over a decade. And so why there wasn't better management of the strategic national stockpile going into this. And by the way, I don't think that didn't happen in a single administration. And so we need to understand why there wasn't better management of the strategic national stockpile and a better investment. And then I'll close by saying, this isn't unique to the federal government. I will tell you, post-Katrina, what we understood is states don't invest adequately in their sort of preparation either. States do have a responsibility, whether it's their public health systems or the equipment, they have an obligation to prepare. And it's clear in this instance that they didn't do that either. I'll stop there.
Fran, thanks so much. Let me begin by picking up on a point that you just made with respect to the whys. It's interesting because terror and our sensitivity toward bacteria or bio-terrorism and virus emerged roughly around the same time. And over the last 20 years under both Republican and Democratic administrations, the attitude toward pandemic and bad flu seem to have gone through a sort of boom and bust cycle. The intelligence community, I think there's sufficient evidence to suggest it's been warning about pandemics for a long time. The most recent threat assessment, 2019-2020, I don't know if 2020 has been released yet, basically says we assess the danger of a flu-like pandemic that could cause massive human death and economic destruction to the United States. You had two presidents of different parties, Bill Clinton, and Fran, you know this well, George W. Bush, who read books that essentially alarmed them. I mean, Clinton read, I think, Richard Preston's Cobra event, which talked about a flu-like epidemic, and George W. Bush read John Barry's, I'm assuming it was John Barry's, Spanish flu, and that energized them. Stockpile, early warning, and then it sort of began to slip away. And yet during the same period, in the wake of 9/11, maybe I'm answering my own question, you had a tremendous commitment to counterterrorism, spending billions, if you include Iraq and Afghanistan, trillions of dollars, when in fact, it appears now in hindsight, the real threat to Homeland Security times 20 and 30 in terms of human life and disruption of life in America is virus. 2/3 of the newly discovered human pathogens are viruses. That's a frightening sort of fact. So I guess I'll ask all three of you, why? Why was it boom and bust? How come there was little continuity and investment throughout the period? That's a tough one, isn't it?
Well, I can start. I mean, I would say, first of all, during the period we're talking about, we did focus, as Fran pointed out, on the issue of biological event, whether it be a terrorist event, and we always thought that a bioterror that would be a real weapon of mass destruction, or a pandemic. So I would say it was very much top of mind. Now, it doesn't capture the headlines in the same way that terrorism does, but I think the people in the departments, and I think it was true also in the Obama administration, were very mindful about this. I will say, I think in some ways, the ability to avert a real disaster with SARS in the US, or with MERS, or with Ebola, created a certain sense of complacency. to be honest, you see that in the counterterrorism area too. For a period of time, there was a kind of complaining about why do we have to go through all this security at the airport when we had years of not having a successful attack on aviation. So, I mean, this is partly human nature. It's partly that it's sometimes a little difficult to get your head around what a pandemic is because there's no identifiable enemy or bad guy. You can't send a drone strike out against the virus. But I will tell you that I think after this experience,
Yeah.
it's going to be a long time before people get complacent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say, so people have forgotten in the first year of the Obama administration, that first fall, they faced a flu.
Was it? Yeah.
I can remember getting the call from the White House saying, can I thank you for that flu strategy you left on the shelf when you walked out the door? Because it didn't mean that they used exactly the strategy we had left behind, but there was something on the shelf for them to start from and a playbook that they could work from and they would make their own adjustments from. I agree with Mike. I do think there was a sort of a false sense of comfort taken from the fact that after that, whether it was SARS or MERS or Ebola, we somehow, we were fortunate to avert having that come in a big way to, or in the sense of Ebola at all, to the US. And there was this sense that we could insulate ourselves. I think that explains part of it. What troubles me is, I think it's worth saying, the Strategic National Stockpile is there for a whole host of reasons, including terrorism. And the fact that it's not been, what we've learned is that it hasn't been particularly managed is very troubling to me. It's clearly been underinvested and poorly managed. And that means against a whole bunch of threats, we're poorly prepared, not just the pandemic.
Juliette?
I mean, I've not much more to add. And just picking up on Fred, it is true that, when we did transition and, Michael was the secretary moving into Janet Napolitano, you hear about every scary thing and we got briefed very well on pandemics that it was H1N1, which was the first sort of real crisis for us, meant that we were actually able to test some of the plans, and some of the lessons, I think, as Fran was saying, may have been taken too literally. I think one was it was essentially confined to border states. I think that this idea of a 50-state pandemic, while it's conceptually so obvious, right, that you wouldn't be able to confine it, H1N1 was predominantly impacting our border states. And then the second thing is, on the Strategic National Stockpile and sort of the resources or the triggers where the federal government is good at doing this. My worry now is not simply, where the supply chain is right now and where the Strategic National Stockpile is. If we believe what everyone is telling us, that you're looking at sort of waves, possibly a sort of summer wave because we're coming out too early in some states, and then a natural second wave in the fall. That thing we better get that thing organized now, because it's not a matter of, oh, New York is done with 1 million masks or whatever. This is going to be a continuing burden on the strategic on the stockpile that could last for at the very least this year.
You've all been, how can I put this? Well, diplomatic is not the right word, I think, under these circumstances, but you've all been exceedingly sensitive to the reality of what it's like to be in government, confronting crisis. And now that you're out of government, sensitive to the fact, at least during this event, of refraining from opening your presentations with an evaluation or a critique of the current administration. And it's clear that pandemic is not a Republican issue and it's not a Democratic issue. It's an American issue. And frankly, I've worked and voted for both Democrats and Republicans. And the dividing line for a policy like this isn't between liberal or conservative, left or right, or Democrat or Republican. It's between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And you want America to be on the smart side. So let me ask each of you, if you could, to just quickly evaluate, at least at this point in the crisis, because we're midway, a quarter of the way through, I have no idea. How would you evaluate the current administration's approach going forward? Anticipation, absence of preparation. How would you evaluate it? Fran, can I ask you to start?
Sure. Look, so in my experience, I have never seen a president wrestle with a governor and win, right? Because I come back to where I started. All disasters are local. Wherever I'm sitting today in New York, we have had over 15,000 deaths in New York, almost 11,000 of those in New York City where I'm sitting. No one in New York City is looking to Washington for an answer. Right. Everybody in New York is looking to Governor Cuomo, right? Because he is the local politician that will lead us through this. And so I think you have to understand, it's just not, if you're in Washington and I was advising the president, taking on Governor Cuomo is not a good idea. I will tell you, I think the president's figured that out. He's met with Governor Cuomo. He's spoken to him. They've talked about the strategic national stockpile, what will be the governor's responsibility in terms of testing, and what the federal government's responsibility will be going forward in terms of managing the supply chain. That's exactly what you do want to see. And so I think that they've worked through what the right balance in terms of the relationship and responsibilities are. And I think that's to the credit on both sides. I think both sides see this is not in anybody's interest for there to make this political. They've got to get through this. The other thing I think is you've got to be transparent. You've got to be transparent about what the state need is. And by the way, what the federal capability is and is not, what you have and what you don't have to give to the states. Because then the states have got the capability through the emergency compacts to be able to share among themselves, and they can sort it out. And so this is why the roles and responsibilities Mike opened up with are really important to understand, and the feds have an enabling role there. And so in that sense, I actually think that has gone better than one might have expected.
Juliette?
Oh, so just picking up, I think the period that this is, how do we want to look back now? When do we want to look back? But I do think we cannot forget the months of January and February and say the first week of March in terms of what was known, even people who were not getting special intelligence. I'm just reading, the people that I generally read, what was known, what we understood to be happening, our belief that China was clearly lying at various moments. We would certainly not be surprised about that. And what was likely to come, and then what's the federal government's responsibility in that regard? So it's as Fran's been saying, it's been goods and a supply chain, getting tests to the states. It is briefing, as the department often did, briefing governors and mayors to prepare them for what is likely to happen. Should it come, which we should have anticipated. It is getting prepared on the sort of operational front, getting locals and states prepared. They are going to execute on all the plans. Were our hospitals ready, and how in the know were they? Providing PPE and having our first line health workers ready for when it came. Nursing homes, people, were they ready? Did they understand what was going on? That is where the death rate, the big death rate, is going to come from in the end when we finally look at the numbers. And then finally, preparing the American public for what was about to happen to them. I think all of us on this call knew that social distancing was going to, if this was as bad as we worried it was, as those numbers started to come out in early March, knew that an aggressive social distancing was literally the only tool we had left to protect Americans, but also to protect our health system. I think that sort of shock and jolt of, it would have been shocking and jolting regardless. No one can prepare for what we're going through. But I think that the communication from we've got this under control, it's not a big deal, it's like the flu, those matter. In the sense of, are you preparing people? And then of course their mayors and governors for what is likely to happen, which is this, right? And then are we prepared for what's likely to happen the next couple of years?
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there'll obviously be a review after the fact, but I do think something Juliette said is important. People don't often focus on how the messaging really matters, because you're trying to affect behavior of over 300 million people. And to do that, you've got to communicate with them. You've got to be clear about expectations. You've got to be clear about what the threat is. And you've got to send a message that is understandable and consistent. Now, you've had some people like Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx who are very credible and measured. It's not helpful to suggest this is going to be over with in a matter of a few days because it's like a flu. It's not helpful to suggest that there's a miracle drug out there that we're ready to start distributing when it turns out apparently there's some fatal side effects. And it's not helpful to suggest that when the governors are making decisions about sheltering in place, what should be open and what should be closed, that they're acting like tyrants and we need to liberate them. What we don't want is to have groups of people, perhaps encouraged by some of our overseas adversaries, decide they actually want to create conflict with some of these rules. And I understand the rules are tough and you can debate how they ought to be calibrated, when they ought to be turned up and down, but questioning the motives or the patriotism of people who are wrestling with this is not a useful thing for getting people to manage the crisis.
I think that's a very good point. Let me ask, though, about the balance between local, state responsibility and federal responsibility when it comes to an issue like testing. I know you're not specialists in infectious diseases or epidemiologists, but it seems to me that issue is critically important now. It may have a lot to do with what happened then in the early days and weeks with respect to early CDC efforts, but now, what is the right balance here between forgetting the numbers of tests? I mean, if the docs are correct, that we need 3 times the number of tests, roughly 3 times the 150,000 that are taking place every day. And I saw one figure that we need by September.
Yeah.
Particularly, there's going to be a resurgence, 3 million tests a week. What is the real balance here between testing and the responsibility of federal government and the states? Any one of you can jump in on this.
Well, I mean, the question is, so people use the word testing and it can mean a lot of different things because there's components of the testing that are also lacking. So I think the White House and the states are saying, neither believes that they're not telling the truth, because the White House is saying things like the states have the capability, they have the framework, they have the capacity, and the states are saying we don't have it. So where's that disjoint from? And it's essentially that once you get pieces, different parts of the testing capability to the states, they are assets to the states, they are ready to go. Your question is interesting because I think I was trying to think about why I was slightly jarred by your question, because this idea of whose role or responsibility, while true, it matters in terms of execution of something. Generally, what you would have is you would have a demand and you would have a supply. You would figure out how you get the supply to the demand. And if you didn't have enough supply, the federal government would either buy it, under the Defense Production Act, or require it be manufactured, or get it from another country. And so it generally wouldn't work.
We may have lost. Juliette, are you there?
I am here. Do you hear me? Yeah. So generally okay, good. So generally, I'll just be quick. That tension for something like supplies, granted this is a big event, 50 states are demanding it, wouldn't be so, I think, let's just say, we wouldn't view it as the federal responsibility or the state responsibility. You would sort of say, what do the states need, and let's deliver it to them. This is just the tension that is coming from the White House, between the White House and the states. I think, as Fran rightly says, the president appears to now recognize that both the politics and also the fact that testing is of concern to many people about moving forward means that I think that they'll be able to deliver more quickly.
I also,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
Fran, go ahead.
I also think it's important that we're clear about when we talk about testing,
Yeah.
right? There's different kinds of testing, and I think you need all of it, right? It's the affirmative testing for corona, for COVID-19. There's also the antibody testing. And by the way, we need to understand, what does the antibody testing tell us? Do you need a certain load of the antibodies for it to be meaningful? How long does that antibody protection last for, and against what? Many of these questions remain unanswered. And so before you can do exactly what Juliette's talking about, and that is go out and procure the tests, you've got to make sure you've got tests that are accurate and are giving you information upon which the secretary, the governors can make decisions based on.
Michael?
Yeah, I think Fran's point is right on. I mean, I think testing is a complicated issue, and one of the challenges is understanding the significance of a test. There's been some debate lately about whether people test negative and then it turns out they're positive. And is that a flaw in the test? Is that something to do with a particular immunity? Is there in fact immunity? And
Michael, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. And I think where the federal government has to play a role is in validating what are good tests, in reconciling some of the scientific disputes. The actual operational administration of the testing will be done at a local level.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, we have some questions. Let's go to a few of these before we come back. I have a couple more for the three of you. Ishan Tafur from the Post has a question about climate change, which I think is a good one looking forward. How does, or how may, our current experience of the pandemic impact the ongoing conversation about that issue, both on a national and a global level? Do you see a growing political recognition of the fragility of our societies and the need to mitigate against environmental threats? Or will, and this is, I think, the critical part, will publics around the world be too exhausted and economically ravaged to want to reckon with more drastic overhauls to their way of life? It gets to the issue of, is this a transformational moment?
Yeah.
Or are we going back to, well, not quite business as usual, but a transactional approach?
I think this is a critical issue right now, and maybe the most critical issue we face, because I think there are two clear lessons out of this. One is the effect of a global disaster and a
I think
catastrophe.
we may have lost you.
No, he's there.
No,
Yeah, you're there.
The
David,
effect
it might be, I think, Aaron, I think it might be you, because I hear
Yeah.
it throughout.
Unfortunately, you may be right.
The effect of a global catastrophe and a disaster has ramifications beyond most of the things we worry about all the time. I mean, the only thing that would be an exception would be nuclear war. And so that ought to motivate people to treat this very seriously, particularly because there's a little opportunity now as we turn the economy back on to turn it on a way that reduces the carbon footprint. But the other lesson, I think, is this. And look, I mean, I'm not naive about the geopolitical differences between us and the Chinese.
Yeah.
But, you know, we all breathe the same air and we're all going to live with the same rising seas. And whatever we may disagree with about some things, we're going to need to sit down with them and our like-minded allies and the Southern Hemisphere and everybody else and figure out what can we do collectively to protect the global commons against either pandemic diseases or disastrous climate change. And my biggest hope, frankly, is the younger generation of folks who do seem to take this seriously,
Yeah.
and all of us ought to get on board.
That's a great point. Tom Warwick from the Atlantic Council asks via email, what are the consequences of congressional budget cuts to civilian agencies such as HHS and DHS caused by sequestration? Rebuilding the strategic stockpile that was one of the things that got cut when funds were tight.
Fran, I mean, I think, you know, obviously budgets matter. They are a sign of our priorities and even moral evaluation. So to say that budgets don't matter is ridiculous. So I think if you look at the trajectory of HHS and CDC through administrations, there's much to be said for that. But I think there has been a difference lately, and I know Michael's written about it under the Trump administration. The first is turning the Department of Homeland Security solely into a border enforcement agency. I think, you know, if you look at FEMA's budget, if you look at other hazards that they are supposed to be focused on, you know, border enforcement became, and immigration became the sort of, you know, the sort of terrorism focus that brought the department into being in the first place. The department under Michael and Ridge and all of them had opened up its lens to really think about all hazards, climate change, cybersecurity, pandemics, and terrorism, of course. That focus had a tremendous impact on, for a variety of reasons, at the department, which is relevant just because the department has a huge role, obviously, in pandemic preparedness. The other is much is said about the preparedness office at the NSC getting disbanded. I think there's actually a bigger story out of do bureaucracies matter, because I do think they do. And I think that was the demotion of Fran's former role and Lisa Monaco's to a status that viewed Homeland Security issues as sort of subsumed within national security issues. They are complementary, they are different, just given all the things that we've discussed. I think that change more recently that has happened probably was very significant in terms of the as well as budget, but in terms of just that sense of there's someone next to the president, like Fran was every day, focusing on a very, you know, as I said, complementary to national security, but also different. And so I think we sort of forget that part of the changes at the national security staff that happened as well.
You know, and I would
Anybody
say,
else
in
want to
addition,
weigh in on- Fran, go ahead, sorry.
in addition to the budget issue, and I think sequestration does matter, there's also the budget issue, and I'm going to come back to it, at the state level, right? The underinvestment there. So it's the sequestration at the federal level that hurt the strategic national stockpile is magnified, right? Because the states are underinvesting. And part of the way you can sort of make up for some of that is by maximizing, leveraging what resources do exist. So I think one of the consequences of this disaster is we ought to look at an emergency medical response team. That is a national capability. The federal government should fund it, but the ability to move, we knew here in New York, we didn't have sufficient medical personnel, and because of state licensing, it was difficult for people to come in and volunteer. We ought to set up a national system where licensed qualified people can come into the state where the emergency is and volunteer. And that's the sort of thing the feds could fund and exercise to make sure it was ready.
We've got a question from Jeff Selden from Voice of America. And that is, should pandemic planning be a greater part of the administration's national security and homeland security strategy? Question is, will it be? And that, I think, is people are forgiving, forgetful. They clearly won't be in the wake of this anytime soon. But will it essentially occupy a central place, both in budgets, national security priorities in the wake of this event?
You'd certainly think so. And as I said earlier, I think there'll be some kind of a commissioner look back, which will spur that. I also think, Congress has to play a role in this.
Yeah.
A little bit of a sense over the last, 10 years, Congress has been mainly in gotcha mode, looking to investigate and get the, political adversaries with something embarrassing. But we haven't had enough of the strategic long-term thinking by Congress, which often leads to funding and authorizing the kinds of things we're talking about here. I should say one notable, commendable exception to that is the Senate Intelligence Committee, which has kind of stood out as a serious place to look at real threats. But I think we have to do that across the board.
I think it is my connection. I have wanted to, we're going into periods of Bermuda Triangle here. Monty McMurchie asks on YouTube a fundamental question, which has to do with the role of government. I would argue the role of small government, if there ever was such a thing post Depression, World War II, has always been a bit of an illusion. But do you think this crisis, and I suppose it depends on the way it's resolved, but either way, will it restore or create a greater sense of trust and confidence? And obviously not just here, in the contract between the governed and those who govern. It's going to be a fundamental question for democratic and authoritarian polities around the world to grapple with. But what about here? Here in America, where government intrusion, intervention, responsibility always carries. Well, you see it now in a number of states and in the Liberate response. Will this restore or undermine Americans' faith in government, federal government, and even state government?
Well, I think the answer to the question is different whether you're talking about federal or state. I think, I've always been, over the course of my career, I've always been amazed. The American people, I think we often underestimate them.
Yeah.
As long as you're transparent, including if it's bad news or it's a mistake, the American people will be quite forgiving and quite understanding. But what they demand is you're being straightforward with them. And so I think as long as you're completely transparent and straightforward, you tell them what to expect and you tell them where we're going, that the American people will follow you there. And that's what instills confidence. To the extent you're unwilling or unable to do that, that's where I think people lose confidence. And so I come back to the example here in New York. Governor Cuomo has been incredibly transparent about what to expect in terms of infection rate, death rates, what we were going to have to, what we could expect to see, and that's what we saw, what was going to be coming forward and how we would flatten the curve and come out of it. And that's been exactly what's happened. And I think so people have walked away with greater confidence in the state government for sure. And I think it remains to be seen what are the American people's judgment on a federal level. I don't think we're far enough through it yet to make the judgment.
I just would add one thing. I think Fran is exactly right. And I think, TBD in some ways on all ends. But just one data point that I find, in the cacophony of the noise and the distortions, close to 70% of Americans, despite everything horrible going on with the economy, despite so many people having lost their jobs and the stresses on every individual family, some much more so than others, 70% want to continue social distancing, understand its benefit, and fear more coming out early than not, than any impact on the economy. In other words, so we will come out, and we should come out responsibly. No one's for staying in, right? It's a we're buying time, and we should use it wisely. But I just find that a really good data point. I mean, in the sense that all the noise about, as if there's an either or about life or the economy, I think most Americans get it. They get it, and they get that sacrifice is needed to get to the other side.
Michael, do you want to add a thought?
I think it reinvigorates to some degree the importance of state government, because it's the states that have the kind of pulse closest on the population, and they tailor their response. And I think, frankly, most of the governors, not all of them, but most of them have come out of this looking good.
Let me conclude with a quote, and then one final question to the three of you. Peter Daszak, who's head of the Echo Alliance, was quoted in a forthcoming, I think on Sunday, New York Times Magazine piece. And this is what he said, quote, "An alarm went off with SARS and we hit the snooze button. And then we hit it again with Ebola and Zika. Now we're awake. We should think about where we go from here." So very briefly, to the next president, Republican or Democrat, in your memo, give me the 3 critical points that need to be made. Thematic altitude here, not necessarily granular, oh, who knows? Fran, you've written a lot of those.
Yeah. So look, I think to Michael's point, you've got to develop roles and responsibilities within the federal government and with the state and locals. That means exercises. That means developing those relationships. That's things like I mentioned before, developing capabilities, leveraging what exists, like an emergency medical response corps that's a national capability. It means investing in things at the federal level, which is like the strategic national stockpile, right? Investing in what your federal capabilities are, understanding what they are. And I think ultimately, if you want to have a better handle, how you respond on the front end absolutely affects your ability to respond throughout the entire thing. And so reinvesting in your biosurveillance capability really determines whether or not you can better contain an event early on. And so biosurveillance is the other key here. Those are the 3 I would emphasize.
Thank you, Michael.
I agree with those. And let me say, by the way, the first thing I would do is I'd lay out what I think are existential threats. Obviously, pandemic is one, global change is another, and a major cyber attack is a third. And we have to be prepared for all those, and they might even come linked to each other. They might not come, separately. And then I would add, in addition to being mindful of those 3 existential threats, the need to build resilience in the public and private sector, which means redundancy and plan B for a whole lot of things, including the supply chain. And the third thing I'd say is we've got to reinvigorate our trust relationships with other countries. When other countries don't trust you and they think you're transactional, their willingness to help you diminishes. And this is, to use the Benjamin Franklin phrase, if we don't hang together, we are most assuredly going to hang separately.
Juliette, last word.
Oh, those were also good. So my 3 words are invest in a stronger, with WHO, a stronger surveillance system, and one that we have confidence in. The second is transparency. It's just from the beginning. These things don't go away. They don't get better. And transparency to the American public, but as importantly to the frontline workers who will be the first people who encounter a disease. And then the third, which we just hadn't mentioned, so I thought I'd hear, is just the necessity, I think, to or the failure, which always surprised me, of protecting public safety and public health workers early on is something that we need to invest in immediately, both in terms of education. Do they know what's coming down the pike? But of course, not exposing them. When you start to look at the numbers everywhere from public health to our police departments of people who have been exposed, who are sick or who are dying, we are now more NYPD have died of coronavirus than did on the day of 9/11, although many died later due to 9/11 illnesses. We just got to get really serious about that. If we lose our frontline first responders, the rest is history. It's impossible to go forward.
Juliette, thanks. I want to thank the three of you. These are stressful, fraught, and very strange times, and all of you have brought a wisdom, an authority, and real experience to issues that affect all of us. And I want to thank the three of you. And to our participants, if you like this Carnegie Connects episode, be sure to subscribe to our channel to stay tuned for our next event. And to everybody, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll offer my personal opinion, stay at home.
Hey, that's a good one. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Stay safe.
Bye. Thanks.